It's around 1600 years before Christ, and the ancient world is already bustling with great civilizations. Egypt is building magnificent pyramids and temples. Mesopotamian cities are thriving with trade and culture, and established powers seem to have carved up the known world between them. But high in the rugged mountains of what we now call Turkey, something extraordinary is stirring. The Hittites didn't start as empire builders. They were tough mountain people, scattered across the harsh highlands of Anatolia, living in small city-states that constantly fought each other. Imagine trying to farm rocky soil while your neighbors might raid your cattle at any moment. It was a hard life that bred hard people. But sometimes, the most unlikely circumstances create the most remarkable transformations. Around the 1700s before Christ, these feuding mountain clans began to unite under strong leaders. What started as local alliances slowly grew into something much bigger. The Hittites had a crucial advantage that many historians overlook. They were absolutely relentless learners. When they encountered new technologies, new tactics, or new ideas, they didn't just adopt them, they improved upon them. Take their approach to warfare, for instance. The Hittites saw the horse-drawn chariots that other civilizations were using and thought, "We can do this better." They didn't just copy what they saw, they revolutionized the entire concept. Traditional chariots were heavy, clunky things, more like moving platforms than true war machines. The Hittites stripped them down, made them lighter, faster, and deadlier. Their secret weapon was the spoked wheel. While others were still using solid wooden wheels that made chariots slow and difficult to maneuver, the Hittites perfected the art of creating wheels with spokes. This might sound like a small detail, but it was revolutionary. Suddenly, their chariots could race across battlefields, wheel around enemy formations, and strike with lightning speed. Each chariot carried a driver and an archer, and Hittite archers were legendary for their accuracy even at full gallop. But here's what made the Hittites truly formidable. They understood that military innovation meant nothing without proper organization. They created one of the first professional armies in history. While other civilizations relied on farmers who picked up weapons during fighting season, the Hittites developed a corps of career soldiers who lived and breathed warfare. They established military academies, standardized training, and created a command structure that could coordinate thousands of men in battle. Their expansion wasn't just about conquest, it was strategic and calculated. The Hittites identified the key trade routes that connected Asia to Europe and systematically took control of them. They understood that controlling trade meant controlling wealth, and controlling wealth meant controlling power. City by city, region by region, they built their empire not just through force but through economic leverage. What's fascinating is how quickly they adapted to ruling diverse peoples. The Hittites were remarkably tolerant for their time. When they conquered a city, they didn't usually destroy its temples or force people to abandon their gods. Instead, they often adopted local deities into their own pantheon. This wasn't just smart politics. It was revolutionary thinking that helped them rule over dozens of different ethnic groups and cultures. By 1500 before Christ, these mountain people had transformed themselves into one of the great powers of the ancient world. They controlled territory from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt, commanded trade routes that connected 3 continents, and had built cities that rivaled anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt. The Hittites had gone from feuding hillside clans to masters of an empire that would challenge the greatest civilizations of their age. But their rise was just the beginning. The real test would come when this upstart mountain empire found itself face to face with the most powerful civilization of the ancient world, Egypt. And that confrontation would produce one of the most epic battles in human history, a clash so massive and consequential that both sides would claim victory, and both would be changed forever. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine whether these mountain warriors could truly stand as equals among the giants of the ancient world. If you love history as much as we do, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires to keep unraveling the legends of the ancient world. You know, there's something almost magical about the moment when everything changes. Picture the ancient world around 1600 years before Christ. Egypt is absolutely dominating the scene with their new kingdom pharaohs building monuments that still take our breath away today. Mesopotamia is buzzing with trade. Their cities are cultural powerhouses, and everyone assumes the world map is pretty much set in stone. The great powers have their territories, their spheres of influence, and their comfortable arrangements. But then, from the harsh mountains of Anatolia, something completely unexpected happens. The Hittites don't just join the game, they flip the entire board. Now, here's what made the Hittites so different from every other rising power of their time. Most empires grew through sheer numbers or by controlling key resources. The Hittites? They grew through pure innovation. They looked at how warfare had always been done and said, "This is all wrong. We can do better." Let me tell you about their chariots because this is where their genius really shows. Traditional chariots were basically moving fortresses, heavy, slow, and designed more for show than for actual fighting. Kings would ride them to look impressive, but in real combat, they were often more trouble than they were worth. The wheels were solid wood, which made them incredibly heavy. The whole thing was built like a tank, which sounds good in theory, but meant they moved like one too. The Hittites completely reimagined what a chariot could be. They created something that was part racehorse, part fighter jet. Their secret was the spoked wheel. Instead of solid wood, they used a hub with spokes radiating out. This cut the weight dramatically while actually making the wheel stronger. Suddenly, their chariots could race across battlefields at speeds that must have seemed supernatural to their enemies. But here's the brilliant part. They didn't just make faster chariots. They completely changed how chariots were used in battle. Traditional armies used chariots like we might use a limousine, to transport important people safely. The Hittites turned them into mobile weapons platforms. Each chariot carried a driver and an expert archer, and these archers could fire accurately even while racing at full speed. Imagine being an enemy soldier standing in formation when suddenly hundreds of these lightning-fast chariots come thundering toward you. Before you can even react, they're wheeling around your flanks, arrows flying with deadly precision, and by the time you turn to face them, they're already gone, striking somewhere else entirely. It must have been terrifying and completely demoralizing. The Hittites perfected what military historians call shock and awe warfare thousands of years before the term existed. They understood that winning battles wasn't just about having more soldiers. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight. Their chariot tactics were designed to create chaos, confusion, and fear. Enemy armies would often break and run before the real fighting even began. From their mountain strongholds, Hittite armies swept down into Syria and the Levant like nothing the world had ever seen. City after city fell to their revolutionary tactics. But here's what's really fascinating. They weren't just brutal conquerors. The Hittites were incredibly sophisticated in how they thought about power and control. While other empires relied purely on force to hold their territories, the Hittites understood that real power came from combining military might with diplomatic skill. They were among the first to realize that sometimes a treaty was more valuable than a victory. They would defeat an enemy in battle, but then instead of simply destroying them, they would offer terms that were actually reasonable. This approach led to something absolutely revolutionary for its time, the world's first known peace treaty. And not just any peace treaty. This was an agreement between the Hittites and Egypt, the two superpowers of the ancient world. Think about how remarkable this is. These mountain people, who had been unknown just a few centuries earlier, were now sitting down as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt, hammering out terms that would shape the politics of the entire region. The treaty wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a recognition that the Hittites had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the ancient world. They had proven that innovation, strategy, and diplomatic skill could challenge even the most established empires. They had shown that sometimes the most unlikely people, from the most unlikely places, could rise to shake the very foundations of civilization. And this was just the beginning. The Hittites were about to face their greatest test, a confrontation that would determine whether these mountain warriors could truly stand as equals among the giants of the ancient world. The stage was set for an epic clash that would echo through history. Picture this. It's 1274 years before Christ, and the ancient world is about to witness something that had never happened before. A collision between two genuine superpowers at the absolute height of their strength. On one side, you have Ramses II of Egypt, a pharaoh so confident in his own greatness that he's already building monuments to himself across the empire. On the other side, there's Muwatalli II of the Hittite Empire, a king who commands the most advanced military machine the world has ever seen. The tension had been building for decades. Both empires were expanding, both needed the same trade routes, and both refused to back down. Syria had become the flashpoint, this wealthy, strategically located region that both powers claimed as their rightful territory. The city of Kadesh sat right in the middle of it all, like a prize that both giants were determined to claim. Now Ramses wasn't just any pharaoh. This was a man who genuinely believed he was a living god, and he had the military power to back up that belief. He assembled what was probably the largest army Egypt had ever fielded, around 20,000 men divided into 4 massive divisions, each named after Egyptian gods: the Amun division, the Ra division, the Ptah division, and the Seth division. Each one was a complete army in itself, with infantry, archers, and hundreds of chariots. But Muwatalli wasn't intimidated. The Hittite king had been preparing for this moment his entire reign. He gathered allies from across Anatolia and beyond, warriors from dozens of different peoples who had all sworn loyalty to the Hittite throne. His army was smaller than Ramses, but it was built around those revolutionary Hittite chariots that had been terrorizing battlefields for generations. More importantly, Muwatalli was a master of battlefield tactics, while Ramses was more of a showman than a general. The stage was set for what would become one of the most famous battles in human history, but it almost didn't happen the way either side planned. Ramses was marching north with his 4 divisions when he encountered some local Bedouins who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. The Hittite army was far away, still gathered near the city of Aleppo, too scared to face the mighty pharaoh. Ramses believed them completely. After all, he was a god. Who would dare lie to him? But those Bedouins were actually Hittite spies, and they had just delivered one of the most successful pieces of military deception in ancient history. While Ramses was celebrating his apparent luck, Muwatalli was positioning his entire army just beyond the hills around Kadesh, completely hidden from Egyptian scouts. Ramses, feeling overconfident, pushed ahead with just his lead division, the Amun division, while his other 3 divisions stretched out over miles of countryside behind him. He was planning to capture Kadesh quickly and present his army with a fait accompli. It was exactly the kind of reckless move that Muwatalli had been hoping for. Then came the moment that changed everything. Egyptian scouts captured 2 real Hittite spies, and under interrogation, they revealed the truth. The entire Hittite army was hidden just beyond the next hill, perfectly positioned to strike. Ramses suddenly realized he had walked straight into a trap with only 1/4 of his army immediately available. What happened next was like something out of an action movie. Muwatalli launched his chariot attack just as Ramses's 2nd division, the Ra division, was crossing the river near Kadesh. Over 2,000 Hittite chariots came thundering out of concealment, hitting the Ra division while they were most vulnerable. The entire division collapsed in minutes, soldiers fleeing in panic toward where Ramses was camped with the Amun division. Picture the chaos. Thousands of terrified Egyptian soldiers running for their lives, Hittite chariots in hot pursuit, and Ramses suddenly finding himself surrounded by enemies with most of his army still miles away. According to Egyptian records, the pharaoh himself grabbed his bow and fought like a man possessed, trying to rally his troops while enemy chariots circled his position. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Just when it looked like Ramses was about to be captured or killed, something unexpected happened. A force of Egyptian allies, probably Canaanites who had been approaching from the coast, suddenly appeared and attacked the Hittite chariots from behind. The Hittites, who had been focused on finishing off Ramses, were caught completely off guard. The battle turned into absolute chaos. Over 5,000 chariots were now racing across the plains of Kadesh, arrows flying, men screaming, horses dying. The dust must have been so thick that nobody could see more than a few yards in any direction. Units got separated, commanders lost control, and what had started as a carefully planned battle became a massive, swirling melee. As the day wore on, both sides fought with desperate intensity. The Hittites had come so close to capturing the pharaoh himself. Imagine what a prize that would have been. But the Egyptians, fighting for their lives and the life of their god-king, showed incredible courage. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Finally, as the sun began to set, both armies pulled back, exhausted and bloodied. Thousands of men lay dead on the battlefield. Hundreds of chariots were destroyed, and both kings were probably wondering how a battle that had seemed so promising had turned into such a costly stalemate. And here's the fascinating part. Both sides claimed victory. Ramses rushed back to Egypt and immediately began carving the story of his great victory into temple walls across the empire. According to Egyptian accounts, the pharaoh single-handedly defeated the entire Hittite army through his divine power and personal courage. Muwatalli, meanwhile, could rightfully claim that he had outmaneuvered the Egyptian army, nearly captured their king, and forced them to retreat from Syrian territory. But the real outcome of Kadesh wasn't about who won or lost. It was about what happened next. Both kings realized that this level of warfare was unsustainable. The battle had been so costly, so destructive, that neither empire could afford many more like it. They had fought each other to a standstill, and continuing the conflict would only weaken both empires against their other enemies. So these two proud rulers who had just spent a day trying to kill each other did something remarkable. They began talking, not immediately. It took about 15 years of careful negotiation, but eventually they hammered out what would become the Treaty of Kadesh, the first major peace agreement in recorded history. The treaty was written on silver tablets and carved into clay, copies made for both courts. It established clear borders, promised mutual assistance against common enemies, and even included provisions for extraditing criminals. Most remarkably, it treated both empires as equals, the mighty pharaoh of Egypt acknowledging the Hittite king as his brother. That treaty still exists today, and you can see copies of it in museums around the world. It's proof that even in the ancient world, even after the most bitter conflicts, human beings could choose diplomacy over destruction. The Battle of Kadesh had shown both empires the terrible cost of war and taught them the greater value of peace. You know what's absolutely fascinating about the Hittites? They weren't just brilliant warriors. They were also master inventors, progressive lawmakers, and keepers of secrets that would change the world forever. While their neighbors were still living in what we call the Bronze Age, the Hittites were already stepping into the future. Let me tell you about their most closely guarded secret: iron. Now, this wasn't just any metal. This was revolutionary technology that would eventually transform human civilization. While everyone else was still making weapons and tools from bronze, which is basically copper mixed with tin, the Hittites had discovered something far superior. Iron was harder than bronze, much harder. It could hold a sharper edge, it was more durable, and most importantly, it was potentially much more abundant than bronze. The problem was that iron is incredibly difficult to work with. Bronze melts at a relatively low temperature that ancient smiths could easily achieve with their furnaces. But iron requires much higher temperatures and completely different techniques. The Hittites somehow cracked this code. They figured out how to build furnaces hot enough to smelt iron ore, and more importantly, they discovered the secret of creating steel by adding just the right amount of carbon to iron. This wasn't just a technical breakthrough. This was like discovering gunpowder or inventing the computer. It was technology that could change the balance of power forever, and the Hittites knew exactly how valuable this secret was. Iron working was so closely guarded that revealing the techniques to outsiders was punishable by death. The smiths who knew how to work iron were essentially state secrets themselves. They were kept in special workshops, probably under heavy guard, and their knowledge was passed down only to carefully chosen apprentices. Think about what this meant on the battlefield. While enemy soldiers were carrying bronze swords that might chip or bend in combat, Hittite warriors were wielding iron weapons that could cut right through bronze armor. It was like bringing a machine gun to a sword fight. This technological advantage helped explain how the Hittites could punch so far above their weight, challenging empires that had far more people and resources. But here's what's really remarkable. The Hittites didn't just hoard this technology forever. Eventually, as their empire began to weaken in the 1200s before Christ, ironworking knowledge began to spread. Some scholars believe that fleeing Hittite craftsmen took their skills to other lands, jump-starting the Iron Age across the Mediterranean world. It's possible that the collapse of the Hittite Empire actually accelerated human technological development by releasing this closely guarded secret. Now, while the Hittites were revolutionizing warfare with their iron weapons, they were also revolutionizing something else that might surprise you: law and justice. Most people think of ancient empires as brutal, arbitrary places where the strong did whatever they wanted to the weak. But the Hittites developed one of the most sophisticated and surprisingly humane legal systems of the ancient world. Their legal code, which we've been able to reconstruct from clay tablets found in their capital city, shows a civilization that valued order, fairness, and proportional justice. Instead of the eye for an eye approach that many ancient cultures used, the Hittites preferred what we might call restorative justice. If you stole something, you didn't lose your hand. You paid compensation to the victim. If you damaged someone's property, you made it right by giving them something of equal value. This might not sound revolutionary to us, but in a world where many legal systems relied on physical punishment and public executions, the Hittite approach was remarkably progressive. They seemed to understand that a stable society needed predictable, fair laws that focused on making victims whole rather than just punishing wrongdoers. What's even more surprising is how they treated women. In most ancient societies, women had very few legal rights. They were essentially property of their fathers or husbands. But Hittite law granted women significant protections and freedoms. Women could own property, run businesses, and even initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances. If a woman was widowed, she had legal rights to her husband's estate. If she was assaulted, the law provided specific punishments for the perpetrator and compensation for her. The Hittites also had detailed laws about everything from livestock theft to marriage contracts. If someone stole your cow, the law specified exactly how much they owed you in compensation. If your neighbor's ox damaged your crops, there were clear procedures for resolving the dispute. They even had laws about what happened if you found lost property. You couldn't just keep it. You had to make a reasonable effort to find the owner. This attention to legal detail reveals something profound about Hittite society. This wasn't just a military machine focused on conquest. This was a civilization that understood that lasting power came from creating stable, predictable institutions that people could trust. They realized that you couldn't rule a multi-ethnic empire through force alone. You needed laws that people saw as fair and legitimate. The Hittites also developed sophisticated administrative systems to govern their vast territories. They created a network of governors and local officials who reported back to the capital. They maintained detailed records of everything from tax collection to military supplies. They even had what we might recognize as a diplomatic corps, with trained ambassadors who could negotiate with foreign powers. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Hittites were deeply religious people who believed that their kings ruled by divine mandate. Their legal system wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about creating a just society that would please the gods. They believed that injustice would bring divine punishment not just on individuals, but on the entire kingdom. This religious dimension helps explain why Hittite law was so focused on restoration rather than revenge. They weren't just trying to punish wrongdoers. They were trying to restore the cosmic balance that crime had disrupted. Every theft, every assault, every broken contract was seen as a wound in the fabric of society that needed to be carefully healed. The combination of technological innovation, legal sophistication, and administrative skill made the Hittites one of the most advanced civilizations of their time. They weren't just successful conquerors. They were successful governors who created institutions that lasted for centuries. Their legal principles influenced later civilizations. Their iron technology transformed the ancient world, and their diplomatic innovations helped establish the foundations of international law. But like all great civilizations, the Hittites faced challenges that would test everything they had built. The secrets that had made them powerful, the laws that had made them stable, and the innovations that had made them great, all of it would soon be put to the ultimate test as their empire faced its greatest crisis. Fascinated by this lost empire? Then leave a comment, smash that like button, share with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, so you never miss our next voyage into antiquity. You know, there's something haunting about the way great civilizations disappear. One day they're dominating the world stage. Their armies are feared across continents. Their diplomats are negotiating with pharaohs, and their cities are bustling with trade and culture. Then, almost overnight, they're gone. Not just defeated, completely erased from memory. That's exactly what happened to the Hittites, and it's one of history's most puzzling mysteries. Around 1200 years before Christ, the Hittite Empire was still a formidable power. They had survived the Great Battle of Kadesh, maintained their iron monopoly, and governed a vast territory that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. Their capital city of Hattusa was magnificent, with massive stone walls, elaborate temples, and royal palaces that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Everything seemed stable, prosperous, and permanent. But then, within just a few decades, it all came crashing down. And here's what makes this collapse so mysterious. We're still not entirely sure what caused it. Was it invasion? Internal rebellion? Climate change? Economic collapse? Or was it something even more dramatic? The evidence suggests it might have been all of these things happening at once, creating a perfect storm that even the mighty Hittites couldn't weather. Let me paint you a picture of what those final years might have been like. Imagine you're a Hittite official in the late 1300s before Christ, trying to manage an empire that's starting to show cracks. Reports are coming in from the borderlands about strange new peoples moving south from the northern regions. These aren't the usual raiders or nomads. These are entire populations on the move, fleeing something that's driven them from their homes. At the same time, your agricultural officials are reporting that the harvests have been poor for several years running. The climate seems to be changing, becoming drier and more unpredictable. Trade routes that have been reliable for generations are being disrupted. Your military commanders are complaining that they need more resources to deal with increased unrest. But your treasury officials are saying there's less money coming in from taxes and trade. Then there are the reports from your coastal territories about mysterious raiders attacking from the sea. These aren't pirates looking for quick plunder. These are organized forces with ships, weapons, and what seems like a coordinated strategy. Egyptian records call them the Sea Peoples, but nobody really knows where they came from or what they wanted. They just appeared along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, attacking cities, disrupting trade, and then vanishing back into the sea. The Hittites had dealt with challenges before, but this felt different. It wasn't just one crisis they could focus on and solve. It was multiple crises happening simultaneously, each one making the others worse. The economic problems made it harder to maintain the military forces needed to deal with the invasions. The invasions disrupted trade, which worsened the economic problems. The climate issues created food shortages, which led to internal unrest, which diverted resources from defending the borders. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Hittite cities were abandoned rather than destroyed in battle. People seem to have simply packed up and left, perhaps fleeing to safer regions or trying to find better opportunities elsewhere. Some cities show signs of being burned, but whether that was from enemy attacks or from the inhabitants destroying what they couldn't take with them, we may never know. The final blow seems to have come around 1180 years before Christ. The great capital city of Hattusa was abandoned, its massive walls and proud temples left empty. The royal archives, containing thousands of clay tablets with the records of centuries of Hittite civilization, were left behind in the ruins. The ironworking shops fell silent. The diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and other powers simply stopped. And then, something extraordinary happened. The Hittites didn't just lose their empire, they vanished from history altogether. Within a few generations, it was as if they had never existed. Their language stopped being spoken. Their cities were forgotten. Their great deeds became legends, then myths, then nothing at all. For nearly 3,000 years, the Hittites lived on only as mysterious references in ancient texts. The Bible mentioned them as one of the peoples of Canaan, but gave no hint that they had once been a great empire. Egyptian records referred to their conflicts with Hatti, but as Egypt itself declined, even these references became obscure. Classical Greek and Roman writers who preserved so much knowledge about the ancient world seemed to know nothing about the Hittites at all. By the time of the Roman Empire, the Hittites were completely forgotten. Medieval scholars reading the Bible knew that there had been some people called Hittites, but they assumed they were just another small tribe among many. The idea that they had once been equals to Egypt, that they had revolutionized warfare and diplomacy, that they had controlled vast territories and commanded great armies, all of this was lost. Then, in the 1800s, something amazing happened. European archaeologists and scholars began exploring the ruins of ancient Anatolia, and they started finding things that didn't match what they knew about ancient history. There were massive stone ruins that were clearly very ancient, but they didn't look Egyptian or Mesopotamian. There were inscriptions in an unknown script that seemed to be in an unknown language. The breakthrough came when archaeologists began excavating at a site called Boğazköy in central Turkey. They uncovered the ruins of what had obviously been a major city, with enormous walls, elaborate gates, and thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing. But this wasn't Babylonian or Assyrian cuneiform. It was something different. In 1906, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler made one of the most exciting discoveries in the history of archaeology. Among the thousands of tablets he found at Boğazköy, he discovered copies of the Treaty of Kadesh, the same treaty that had been found in Egyptian hieroglyphics decades earlier. But this version was written from the Hittite perspective, in the Hittite language, and it identified the site as Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Suddenly, the Hittites were back. After 3 millennia of silence, they could finally speak in their own voice. Scholars began the painstaking work of translating Hittite cuneiform, piecing together their history from thousands of clay tablets. What they discovered was astonishing. A great civilization that had been every bit as sophisticated and powerful as Egypt or Babylon, but had been completely forgotten by history. The tablets revealed the full scope of Hittite achievement, their military innovations, their legal system, their diplomatic correspondence, their religious beliefs, their daily life. They could read the actual words of Hittite kings, their letters to pharaohs, their laws, their prayers, their administrative records. It was like discovering a lost continent of human civilization. But perhaps the most poignant thing about the rediscovery of the Hittites is what it tells us about the fragility of human achievement. Here was an empire that had seemed permanent and unshakable, that had lasted for centuries and influenced the entire ancient world. Yet it had vanished so completely that for 3,000 years, nobody even knew it had existed. The Hittite tablets, preserved in clay and buried in ruins, had kept their secrets safe through the rise and fall of countless other civilizations. They had waited through the classical period, through the rise of Christianity and Islam, through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, through the age of exploration and the Industrial Revolution, until finally, in the 20th century, modern archaeology was sophisticated enough to hear their voice again. The story of the Hittites reminds us that even the mightiest empires are temporary, that even the greatest achievements can be forgotten, but also that sometimes, if we're very lucky, the past can speak to us across the centuries and remind us of the full richness and complexity of human civilization. The Hittites had been silent for 3 millennia, but they had never really been gone. They were just waiting for us to learn how to listen. You know, when I think about the Hittites and their incredible journey from mountain clans to world dominators to forgotten memories, I can't help but wonder what they would think if they could see us today. Here they were, convinced that their empire would last forever, building monuments meant to stand for all eternity, creating laws they believed would govern future generations. And then, in what must have felt like the blink of an eye, it was all gone. But here's the thing that gives me chills. Their legacy didn't actually disappear. It just transformed in ways they never could have imagined. Think about it. Every time you use an iron tool, every time you see a peace treaty signed between nations, every time you witness diplomacy triumphing over warfare, you're seeing the Hittite legacy in action. They didn't just vanish into the void. They became part of the foundation upon which our entire world was built. Their iron technology didn't die with their empire. It spread across the ancient world, carried by fleeing craftsmen and conquered peoples, eventually reaching every corner of the earth. That iron plow that revolutionized agriculture, that steel sword that changed warfare, that metal framework that made possible the buildings and bridges of later civilizations. All of it traces back to those Hittite smiths working in secret workshops, guarding their knowledge like the state secret it was. And their approach to law and diplomacy? That's even more remarkable. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, when diplomats gather today to negotiate peace treaties, when international courts try to resolve disputes between nations, they're using principles that the Hittites helped establish over 3,000 years ago. The idea that conflicts can be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, that agreements between peoples can be binding and lasting, that justice should focus on restoration rather than just punishment. These weren't obvious concepts. Someone had to invent them, and the Hittites were among the first to do so. But I think there's something even deeper here, something that speaks directly to our own time. The Hittites lived through what we might recognize as a period of rapid change and uncertainty. They dealt with climate disruption, mass migrations, economic instability, and technological upheaval. Sound familiar? They faced the challenge of governing a diverse, multi-ethnic empire where different peoples had different languages, different religions, different traditions. They had to figure out how to maintain unity while respecting diversity, how to create shared laws that different cultures could accept, how to build institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances. These are exactly the challenges we face in our interconnected world today. The Hittites also grappled with what we might call the responsibility of technological superiority. They had iron weapons when their enemies still used bronze. They had advanced chariots when others were still fighting on foot. They had to decide whether to use these advantages to dominate others or to create a more stable world through diplomacy and law. It's not so different from the choices we face today with our own revolutionary technologies. And here's what's really fascinating. The Hittites seem to understand that true power doesn't come from having the biggest army or the most advanced weapons. It comes from creating systems that people want to be part of, institutions that provide stability and fairness, and innovations that make life better for everyone. That's a lesson that feels incredibly relevant today. But the story of the Hittites also carries a warning. They were at the height of their power when everything started to unravel. They had grown comfortable, perhaps a bit complacent. They had systems and institutions that had worked for centuries, and maybe they assumed those systems would always work. When multiple crises hit simultaneously, climate change, economic disruption, mass migration, technological upheaval, their established ways of doing things weren't enough. This isn't meant to be depressing, it's meant to be instructive. The Hittites show us that civilizations aren't permanent, but they also show us that human ingenuity, creativity, and resilience can create remarkable things. They remind us that the innovations and institutions we build today will outlast us, just as theirs have outlasted them. When I look at our own world, with all its challenges and uncertainties, I find the Hittite story oddly comforting. They faced problems that seemed insurmountable, and they found solutions that changed the world. They created something beautiful and lasting, even though their empire itself was temporary. They proved that human beings can rise to meet extraordinary challenges and leave the world better than they found it. The Hittites also remind us that history has a way of surprising us. For 3,000 years, they were completely forgotten, their achievements erased from memory. But their story was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. It makes me wonder what other lost civilizations are out there. What other remarkable human achievements have been forgotten? What other voices from the past are waiting to speak to us again? And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The Hittites teach us that human civilization is much richer, much more complex, and much more resilient than we often realize. Every generation thinks they're living through the most important period in history, facing the most difficult challenges, dealing with the most rapid changes. But humans have been adapting, innovating, and creating for thousands of years. We've survived ice ages and plagues, wars and famines, the rise and fall of countless empires. The Hittites were just one chapter in this grand story, but what a chapter it was. Mountain people who became world changers, warriors who became diplomats, innovators who transformed human civilization. And in the end, when their empire crumbled and their cities were abandoned, their most important contributions lived on, not in monuments or palaces, but in the ideas and innovations that became part of the human inheritance. So when you ask what the rise and fall of the Hittites says about our own world, I think the answer is both humbling and inspiring. It tells us that we, too, are just one chapter in history's grand story. Our civilizations, our technologies, our institutions, all of it is temporary. But it also tells us that what we do today, the problems we solve, the innovations we create, the systems we build, these things can echo through the centuries in ways we might never imagine. The Hittites couldn't have known that their iron-working techniques would shape the entire future of human technology. They couldn't have known that their diplomatic innovations would influence international law for millennia. They couldn't have known that their legal principles would inspire concepts of justice that we still use today. They just did their best to solve the problems in front of them, and in doing so, they changed the world. Maybe that's what history is really about. Not the empires that rise and fall, but the human spirit that keeps rising, keeps innovating, keeps building something better. The Hittites are long gone, but their legacy lives on in every act of diplomacy, every application of technology, every attempt to create a more just and peaceful world. And someday, thousands of years from now, maybe someone will look back at our time and wonder what secrets we've left behind, what innovations we've contributed to the great human story. The Hittites remind us that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves, a continuous human journey of discovery, creation, and hope. And that's a legacy worth building on. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more legends, truths, and secrets of the ancient world. Until next time, history awaits.